Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. Garry and I are at it again. We take a look at one of the most iconic books of the Bible, the Book of Daniel. The early Christians loved it. Jews not quite as much, but still included it in their canon. Today, Garry leads us on a deep dive into this Book of Daniel. We explore the context and the background of the book and poke a little fun at a point or two in there of some things that are just really interesting. I think you're really going to enjoy this collaboration between the History in the Bible podcast and the History of the Papacy podcast. If you have ideas for Garry and I on future collaborations, we'd love to hear them, and I hope you enjoy. If you want to connect with me, I'd especially like to hear your questions and comments because I'm putting together, slowly but surely, a questions and comments show. You can send them to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Leave a comment on the website, a2zhistorypage.com, or on any of the social media platforms, particularly Facebook and Twitter, which are both A2Z History Page. You can also, I always appreciate ratings and reviews on iTunes, and you can put your comment and question in there too. I can't wait to hear from you, and I will see you next time. Welcome back to another great collaboration with Stephen and of the History of the Papacy podcast and Garry of the History in the Bible podcast. Garry, how you doing?
I'm doing just tickety-boo, thank you.
Now, we're going to talk tonight about Daniel, and I don't know how we didn't talk. We did talk about Daniel a little bit during our wonderful Apocalypse series, which if you haven't listened to the Apocalypse series, definitely go back and listen to that one.
Yeah, but that was a couple of years ago, so let's refresh your memory about that.
Now, the Book of Daniel is a great Old Testament book. It's a little history, a little of apocalypse. You get a little bit of everything in the Book of Daniel. Garry, you were the one who proposed us to talk about the Book of Daniel. What made you want to talk about this wonderful book?
I think Daniel is one of the more interesting and peculiar books in the Old Testament. It's interesting because it's got a lot of stories in it that everyone knows about. The writing on the wall, for example. All those stories that you hear about in Sunday school. But the second half of the book, which hardly anyone ever talks about, is an apocalypse. And it's the only full-blown apocalypse in the Old Testament. An apocalypse is a whole genre of writing. We have dozens and dozens of apocalypses from what is known as the Second Temple period, which is the period from the return from Babylon to the destruction of the temple by the Romans in AD 70. A huge literature, only one of which actually made it into the Old Testament. The apocalyptic literature was hugely influential on Christianity. So what's an apocalypse? Firstly, it's a genre of writing, like crime fiction or fantasy. And it's a genre which, rather like fantasy, it's full of thunder and lightning and fantastic and surreal imagery. Now, a typical plot in an apocalypse is that some sort of otherworldly being, like an angel, reveals mighty secrets to a hero of old. In this case, it's going to be Daniel. He gets the good info. And the angel imparts an astonishing vision of a transcendent reality, often a vision of the hierarchy, the heavens. And the angel also shows the sage a dreadful future, a revolution about the end of days. Now, the apocalypses tend to be a literature of both hope and despair. They're despair because they hold that the world has no place for good people, for the righteous. But they say, we give you hope. God will eventually intervene in a spectacular world-ending way. But this intervention is sometime in a distant and unknowable future. Another thing about the apocalypses is that they always purport to be written by someone who's been dead for centuries. So someone like Enoch, who lived before the flood, or Abraham, or Daniel, whom the book says lived during the Babylonian captivity. And these old people, or supposedly old people, they put in predictions. The books are not actually written in the time they claim to have been written. Daniel was not actually written during the Babylonian captivity. We have very good reason to think that the book was written, and we can date this very precisely. It was written between the years 167 and November 164 BCE. And I'll tell you why we think that later on.
This is kind of a difficult one to pick out in which direction to go, because there's so many different threads with Daniel, when it was written, all the different parts of it. Let's keep going with what you were going to say.
Now, one of the things about apocalypses, since they purport to be written in the distant past, they give what they claim are predictions, but in fact they're not predictions. They're just recountings of events which purport to be predictions. I mean, it's very easy to give a prophecy and a prediction if it's already happened. In fact, it's the best way to give a prophecy. And these prophecies tend to be reinterpreted through successive ages. So the prophetic section or the apocalyptic section in Daniel has been reinterpreted hundreds of times as some sort of prediction of the future, because it talks about a king of the north and the king of the south. And I think these have been interpreted as Russia versus America, or goodness knows what. They keep being reinterpreted by successive generations. A final aspect of apocalypses in general is that they create a worldview. Unlike anything you find in the actual Old Testament, they depict a cosmic battle between good and evil that is part of God's plan. And this cosmic battle is mirrored on earth. God has determined that the world will eventually end, which could happen at any time, and after this he will set up a perfect earthly kingdom. And only the righteous, those who can decode the apocalypse, will survive the great crisis. So that is the nature of apocalypses in general. The book of Daniel is in two very distinct parts. The first 6 chapters are a collection of quite entertaining folk tales about a guy called Daniel who was supposedly taken into captivity in Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar II conquered Judea. The second part of the book, the final 6 chapters, are the apocalypse proper. One weird thing about the book is that the middle chunk is written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. No one's really quite sure why that is. Most current theories about the book say that the first chapters, the fun folk tales, which I'll discuss in a second, were floating around for a couple of generations. Then someone wrote the apocalyptic section during the time of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and the two got glued together. But why the middle chunk is in Aramaic is unknown, because the Aramaic section overlaps both the folk-tale-y bit and the apocalyptic bit. So that's a little bit of a mystery.
It's shocking too, because if anybody goes out there and picks it up, it's so clear. That line between those two bits is very stark. And you've said that the scholars don't talk much about it, that there's 2 different authors.
Well, the first part seemed to have been independently circulating stories about Daniel. Probably not by one author. They were just nice little folk tales which have been floating around for a couple of generations from maybe Persian times. Whereas the second half of the book is a single cohesive apocalypse.
Before we go too deeply into the folktale bits, because those are so good, we got to give those their time they deserve. That genre of apocalypse, the early Christians really loved it, but this is the first instance of it. Where did that idea come from? Do scholars have an idea of where this idea of the apocalypse genre originated from, or what made it come about?
They don't really know. Because the whole genre of an apocalypse is quite alien to the Old Testament. I mean, Daniel's the only example we have in the Old Testament, and it doesn't cohere with the theological worldview of the Old Testament at all. The apocalypses seem to have arisen at a time when the Jews in Judea were being oppressed. Oppressed by who? The Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks after Alexander the Great, and they're chafing under the bit. And it's fairly clear that, well, hey, where's God? He guided the kingdom of David, etc., but he doesn't seem to be on our side anymore. What's happened to God? So this entire genre arises as a hope for the future. Apart from that, no, people have no idea where it really comes from. Was there one specific person? Was there a school of thought? Because as I said, we have dozens of these things written over the course of several centuries, and we know that they were enormously popular, right through to the late Empire, say in Christian times. And the apocalypse is, of course, deeply affected, for a start, John the Baptist and second, Jesus. Well, they are both the first actual people that we hear of talking about an apocalyptic movement. Now, that's in distinction to the apocalyptic literature. Yeah, we've got lots of books which talk about apocalypses, but we don't hear anyone actually preaching, hey, the end of the world is coming, until we get to John the Baptist. So that's an interesting distinction.
And that's a good amount of time later. If Daniel was written in, what was the specific date?
Say 168 BC.
168, and if John the Baptist is early CE time, 150, 200 years later. Let's get into a little bit about Daniel. He is in that at first, even the very first part of the book, they make it out like Daniel's a superhero.
The story goes that Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, arrive in Babylon as part of the deportation of the Jews. Now, it seems that they're smart young guys, and they're aristocrats to boot. So they are fast-tracked into the Babylonian public service. And they even get shiny new Babylonian names: Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel and his mates have joined the public service in Babylon, but they don't like the Babylonian food. And they refuse to eat it. And they just live on beans and pulses and legumes. Now, it's interesting that Daniel and his mates have problems with eating the foreign food, but they have no problem with taking on Babylonian names.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
The story really kicks off when King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he demands that his court magicians interpret the dream. But Nebuchadnezzar refuses to tell them what the dream actually is. Ha! Take that, magicians. So he says, okay, Daniel, you're a smart young lad. Tell me about this dream. And he begins, O king, as you looked on, there appeared a great statue. The head of the statue was of fine gold. Its breast and arms were of silver. Its belly and thighs of bronze. Its legs were of iron, and its feet part iron and clay. And Daniel goes on to give an interpretation. And he says, You, O Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. Nice one, flattering. But another king will arise after you, then a third kingdom. And so Daniel continues. Most modern scholars say that Daniel is referring to a succession of kingdoms. The Babylonians, followed by the Medes, followed by the Persians, and the Greeks. Nebuchadnezzar says, wow, that's a pretty cool interpretation, even if my empire is destined to fall. So, here, have another gong, another few medals, and get about your work. The next story that we see is the famous fiery furnace.
Another good one.
Another good one. 3 of the youths, curiously missing Daniel himself for some reason, are thrown into the fiery furnace.
Now this one, the fiery furnace, you'll set it up a little bit, but I think this is one that would definitely be one of the Sunday school Daniel stories. Probably Daniel is one of the Old Testament books that you'll get the most Sunday stories out of. And we'll hear a little bit about the Son of Man at the end, which I think we need to talk about the Son of Man a little bit.
Yeah, in fact, I'd say Daniel has more Sunday school stories per chapter than any other book except maybe Genesis, come to think of it. But anyway, back to the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar has demanded that everyone worship a statue. That's an odd thing for a Babylonian king to do. Most of the empires in the Middle East were incredibly tolerant of other religions. They sort of had to be. They had dozens of different religions in their empires. Anyway, for some reason, Nebuchadnezzar has demanded, okay, Daniel and co, I know you're Jews, but you've got to worship this statue. Nebuchadnezzar then chucks in 3 of the Jewish youths into the fiery furnace. Daniel himself has gone AWOL at this point. Goodness knows where he is. They are saved by a mysterious 4th figure, who in traditional Christianity is interpreted to be Jesus. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is so astonished to see the 3 youths emerge from the fiery furnace that he blesses the God of Israel and decrees that the Jews be protected. Some Christians in early modern times interpreted the first 2 chapters of Daniel in very specific ways. They believed that the first 2 chapters, with this series of, say, from the dream, the 4 kingdoms, each superseding the other, represented 4 successive dominions, each worse than the other, and that the final kingdom would launch a great persecution against God's elect. So in this crisis, the kingdoms or monarchies would come to an end as God restored order to the world. So, for example, the Puritans found that Daniel suited their political needs. They saw that the replacement of a series of evil monarchies with the rule of the saints allowed them to identify the prophecy in Daniel with their own quite strong anti-royalist movement. Well, in a sense, they emigrated to America in order to fulfill that prophecy. So in some ways, you could say the book of Daniel is the founding document of the United States.
Bit about the Son of Man and the Son of God. The Christians really ran with that terminology. Other groups like the rabbis and the Jews are like, well, the Son of Man, that doesn't really mean anything. That's more humanity. But obviously, Daniel's getting at something with the Son of Man and Son of God in the furnace. And I think he mentions it again. What does that mean? What does he mean by it, do you think?
Okay, now the Son of Man appears in Daniel chapter 7, which is the first part of his apocalyptic section. Now, Daniel starts off with, in the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream. Afterward, he wrote down the dream. And then Daniel continues that there's 4 beasts, and the 4th beast is fearsome, dreadful, and very powerful. So he lays down this horror that is going to come. But then he says, it's all going to be okay. And Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 has, as I looked on, in the night vision, one like a human being came with the clouds of heaven. He reached the Ancient of Days and was presented to him. Dominion, glory, and kingship were given to him. Now, that translation I have used comes from the Jewish Publication Society translation of the Old Testament. Where I have just read one like a human being, virtually every other English language translation says one like the Son of Man. The Son of Man was in fact a common Hebrew idiom for human being, person. It's like saying someone is the salt of the earth. We don't actually mean that he is a pillar of salt. We mean that he's a good guy, a nice person. The Jews treat the expression Son of Man as they would the normal Hebrew idiom. It just means a person. And maybe Daniel is talking about some person is going to come and save us. Or in later Judaism, the interpretation of this particular verse was the Son of Man actually means the entire corporate entity of the Jews, the Israelites. The Christians, though, took this phrase Son of Man / equals human being as a reference to Jesus the Messiah. Jews, of course, see nothing of the Messiah there. The Son of Man title seems to become attached to Jesus really, really, really early, certainly by the time the Gospels are written. And it became a title. I'm not entirely sure why it became a title, and it's hard to say what it actually means. I mean, in Daniel, to me, it's fairly clear, it's just Hebrew for person. In the Gospels, it becomes basically a synonym for Messiah.
I mean, I would think that in that fiery furnace part that they're getting to something more with that terminology, that there's something supernatural happening. It seems an odd turn of phrase that you're just using Joe Schmo is in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Well, I don't think the Son of Man is used in the fiery furnace passage.
Did they? Maybe I misheard. Maybe I am thinking of chapter 7. Who was in the fiery furnace with them?
Let me get my big boy's Bible out. Hang on, chapter 3. Let me look it up precisely. Oh yeah, here we go.
I'm looking at the New King James Version, but I'm on Bible Gateway, so I can switch that. And it says in chapter 3, verse 26, "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and in the form of the 4th is like the Son of God."
Verse 25, okay, mine has, "He answered, but I see 4 men walking about unbound and unharmed in the fire, and the 4th looks like a divine being."
Well, that's interesting. That is an interesting difference there.
That's a big difference.
Yeah.
So the King James has like the Son of God.
Yeah. Now that was the New King James. Let me look at the good old-fashioned King James Version. It says, "He answered and said, lo," because then it's the King James Version. You have to add "lo" in there. "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And in the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." So King James Version does say Son of God.
What does the New Revised Standard Version have? Oh, this is interesting.
The NRSV. Let's find that one.
And I'll also check the little commentary they have. The commentary I have here is that they say that, okay, divine being means, it simply means angel.
And then in the new, the NSRV, let's see, it starts off, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, 'Was that not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire?' They answered the king, 'True, O king.' He replied," that's 25, "but I see 4 men unbound walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god." That's an odd one, too.
The appearance of a god. I've heard that expression has been translated other places in the Old Testament as basically you're saying angel, divine messenger. I think we need the original Hebrew for this.
Do you know anything? I just looked up the Orthodox Jewish Bible, and that says something slightly different. And he answered and said, "Lo," which maybe this one seems like it might just be a copy of the King James Version. Yeah, I think that might be one. If we have somebody out there who can go to the old Hebrew version.
Does Bible Gateway have Strong's Hebrew?
It does not appear so.
I know there's a Hebrew thing out there somewhere. Oh, Strong's Hebrew, got it. Oh, this will be interesting. Oh, guys, you're getting your money's worth today, huh?
Yeah, you're getting a deep dive.
That's right. Okay, Strong's Hebrew. Oh, I'm homing in on the verse. Oh, this is exciting.
Yeah, you wanted multiple versions of the Bible. You got it today, whether you like it or you don't. I think you like it. That's why you're listening.
Oh, this is interesting. Right, it's literally, "In the midst walking, loose 4 men see I. Look, and he answered, of God the Son is like the 4th. Well, howdy do da day. Let me check that. It's Eliakim Labar. Oh, Bar is son. Eliakim is. It actually does have the Son of God. It's the Son of God, but I don't know if that's idiomatic Hebrew for angel. So, folks, that's as far as we can get you.
And it's just an odd turn of phrase that they're using. That's what struck me, is it's an odd turn of phrase that the Christians really grabbed onto. The Son of God, Son of Man. There's so much in Daniel that directly connects.
Hence its popularity. And it's really one of the books in the Bible which I suppose connects most strongly, doesn't it, to the Christian tradition. You can find a lot of things in here which do connect to Christianity, which you couldn't find in, for example, Exodus. But I find it interesting that the Jewish scholars who wrote the Jewish Publications Society version specifically translated that expression as looks like a divine being. Maybe that is a Jewish reaction to the Christian interpretation saying, hey, this verse is referring to Jesus. Or maybe the Jewish scholars are saying, no, what it really means is, angel.
That's a big part of Daniel, is that the later Jewish and later Christians are looking at it at a very different lens, and then their lens just happen to be competing with each other.
That's true. Actually, if I remember correctly, in Genesis, the passage about the fallen angels and the giants, that refers to them as the sons of God. So, at the minute I am plumping for, the Son of God is a Hebrew idiom for angel.
That's really interesting.
If we've got a bunch of Jewish and a bunch of Christian scholars, they collide, bang. And we're not going to sort that out, are we?
No, we're not. But at least Nebuchadnezzar is not short of any dreams. He has another dream.
He has another dream. This guy needs to go on some sort of meds, I think. He has too many dreams.
And he's not afraid to ask anybody who cares to listen about what his dreams mean.
Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that he's driven away from men. And Daniel interprets this as saying that, yes, he will be driven away from men for 7 years. And after 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar will come to his senses. Thanks to the gods/God. Now, this is one of the places in Daniel where it gets its history totally wrong. In fact, in all of its stories in the folktale sections, its history is constantly wrong. Most of the folktales refer to a king, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, etc., etc. Now, this particular dream about Nebuchadnezzar, prophesying he'll be driven away, actually fits a Babylonian king called Nabonidus. Nabonidus was a wacky guy. He was the last king of Babylon before the conquest by Cyrus the Great of Persia. And Nabonidus was something of an antiquarian. He pretty much invented archaeology. The notion that, some of the things lying around his palace may in fact be really old.
And who'd have thunk it?
Who'd have thunk it? And he came up even with some dating schemes for these objects. He was wildly wrong, but at least he made an effort. Anyway, apparently Nabonidus, after a couple of years of being king of Babylon, he said, I need a holiday. So he walks off to some place in Arabia and stays there for 10 years. Now, the Babylonian king was responsible for a huge number of religious festivals. The earthly pyramid of the Babylonian priesthood culminated in the king. So it'd be like the Pope decides to go to the Bahamas and forget about celebrating Easter and Christmas for 10 years. So you go, please come back, please come back. So apparently Nabonidus' son took over for those 10 years. And Nabonidus only actually came back when Cyrus was on his doorstep. And at that point, the Babylonians thought, oh man, Nabonidus, you're hopeless. We'd actually prefer to be run by the Persians. Thank you, bye. So the dream about Nebuchadnezzar has got nothing to do with either of the two kings called Nebuchadnezzar, but seems to be a reflection of Nabonidus. And in fact, we have some Dead Sea Scroll scraps of Daniel, which actually have the king as Nabonidus, not Nebuchadnezzar. It makes historical boo-boos left, right and centre. It has, for example, mentions a king called Belshazzar, who it says was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. No, he was actually the son of Nabonidus. Daniel says Darius was a Mede. No, Darius was a Persian. Daniel says Darius conquered Babylon. No, that was done by Cyrus the Great. So it's typical folklore stuff. It gets the kings wrong and it just puts in the names of more famous kings. But at least they're fun little stories. Now, after the dream, we have the famous writing on the wall episode.
Oh, that's a good one.
Oh, yeah. Now, until now, Daniel has been saying, well, I'm writing in the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. But suddenly it's now the reign of King Belshazzar. And at a banquet, a ghostly hand appears and writes on the wall in Aramaic, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And Daniel says that this is a prophecy of the conquest of the Babylonian kingdom by the Persians and Medes. Now, those words, they can be translated two totally different ways depending on the vowels you put in there. Because Aramaic, like Hebrew, doesn't write vowels, it just has consonants. Now, one way to translate them is as a series of weights. And in that case, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin would mean something like pound, pound, ounce, gram. And maybe this signals, the continuing failure of the dynasty. But it can also be read as a sequence of verbs, in which case it would be translated as numbered, numbered, weighed, divided. That's a lot more ominous than pound, pound, ounce, gram. And indeed, in the story, according to that very night, Belshazzar is killed, and Darius, or Darius, the Mede, who's not a Mede, he's a Persian, conquers the kingdom. In the final folktale, Daniel in the lion's den, yep, the Babylonians have been conquered by Darius/Darius. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that name.
Well, that one, before we go on to the lion's den, we don't want to rush that one. We want to go into that one and take our time with that one because that one's so good. I'm shocked when I read this one about Daniel Book 5 at Belshazzar's feast with the writing on the wall. Well, nobody seems to be too creeped out that a ghostly hand goes and writes mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, or whatever on the wall. And then they know at this point Daniel's come into bat like 5 times on dreams. And then nobody thinks, oh, wait, let's go and check in on what Daniel thinks about that. They have to go and check with all the soothsayers and the magicians to interpret this. It's like, oh, wait, here's a big shock. There's a guy named Daniel who's pretty good at this.
Well, our other guys have failed to fix the computers for 10 years. But this guy, he's a master technician.
Yeah, he's been fixing them the whole time.
Yeah, the whole time. All the other guys are clowns. Why didn't we think of him first?
And then they throw in that the king's name's Belshazzar, but they've been calling Daniel Belshazzar the whole time. The editor of this has not thought this whole narrative through at all.
It does give the impression of a bunch of separate stories sort of clunked together, doesn't it? It's sort of like like an Aesop's Fables thing or something.
I thought that this chapter 5 was very clunky. This one felt jarring in particular, but then we do go into one of a real gem of the whole book, and that's Daniel and the lions.
Now, everyone will have heard of all the stories we've just mentioned, and they certainly have heard of Daniel and the lion's den. This is the final folktale in the first half of the book. The Babylonians have been conquered by Darius/Darius. Do you know how to pronounce it? I can never remember.
I think people go either way with it. Darius sounds a little bit more, foreign and has a little bit more mystery to it.
Yeah, it's like a British versus American pronunciation.
Yeah,
so it's a bit more Poncy sort of thing.
Let's go with Darius.
Darius, yeah. Yeah, let's go with Darius. So anyway, Darius, because he's just heard that Daniel's been fixing the computers for the past 10 years, he decides to appoint Daniel to a high position. Good on you. But now, in another unlikely episode of religious intolerance, Darius, who's goaded by his high officials, forbids worship of anyone save himself for just 30 days. I mean, what? Now, the Persians were infamously tolerant. The Persians are the guys who told the Jews, oh, you've been stuck in Babylon for 50 years. Please, go home. All yours. And most of them didn't. They actually liked it in Babylon. But the Persians were famously tolerant. So it's incredibly unlikely that any Persian ruler would have said, no, you've got to worship me. Ha! Okay. And just for 30 days. Special month. Now, jealous courtiers report that Daniel is praying 3 times to Yahweh. Whoa! You're not worshipping me? Naughty Daniel. So Darius, who we've just been told regards Daniel as his most effective official, throws him into a pit of lions.
And then the whole thing that they just paint this whole picture that these guys concoct the law, and Darius is all right, okay, whatever. Worship me for 30 days. Then Daniel gets busted, and then the King of Kings, the king of the whole world, as the Shah of Shahs found him, styled himself. He's backed in a corner now, and he's got to punish Daniel because he hasn't filled out a proper thing on his tax return. Like, that's how they make it out to be, that the King of Kings has been backed in the corner by this completely like legalistic argument that he couldn't have just decided, you know what, I'm not going to throw my chief advisor into the lion's den.
Yeah, he gets a pass, or he filled out his conscientious objection form.
Yeah, I guess we got to do it. It is the law after all, even though I'm the King of Kings, and it's my law after all.
Anyway, Daniel is saved by God. Darius rejoices.
Now, I was introduced to the Daniels and the Lions. I wasn't introduced to it, but my son just randomly picked this book off the shelf, and it's an I can read version of the Bible. It's about 30 pages long, but most of it's pictures of Daniel and the lions. And I'm going to read the last little bit, and I think you can tell us the little bit that they forgot in there. We can't show the pictures. The pictures are quite cute of the lions, but Daniel prayed to God, and he asked God to watch over him. That's page 26, page 27. So God sent the angel to help Daniel. Daniel was safe all night. In the morning, the king woke up. He ran to see Daniel. The king said, "Daniel, are you okay? Did your God save you?" "Yes," said Daniel, "God's angel helped me with the lions." The king was so happy. "Come with me, Daniel." The king told all of his people, "Daniel's God is great. Let's pray only to God." They seem to have left out a major portion of that ending in this children's version of Daniel.
Yeah, the verse they left out is Daniel 6:25. Then by order of the king, those men who had slandered Daniel were brought, and, together with their children and wives, were thrown into the lion's den. They had hardly reached the bottom of the den when the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. I don't understand why they left that out.
I don't. That part cracks me up. That would have been a great ending to the book. I wonder what the illustrations would have been for that part.
If it wasn't actually there, you'd think it was some sort of satire, wouldn't you? Or some sort of hideous twist at the end. We need the babies as well to atone for this one.
Yeah, everybody gets, and the lions who are nice and calm and like your kitty cat laying in at your feet in front of the fire, they've suddenly turned into the man-eaters who they were, and they've crushed all their bones before they even got to the bottom of the den. And if there's any reason to read your Bible, that gives you a good one right there.
It does indeed. And after you finish with that, boys and girls, try reading the book of Joshua. Oh, that's a fun read for the destruction of the Canaanites.
And it ends there. That's the folk-tale-y part end, and then we go full-blown apocalypse in chapter 7.
Chapter 7, the first part of the apocalypse, starts off with the vision of the four beasts, and then Daniel says, "No, it's all going to be fine. One like a human being / son of man will come and he'll rescue us all." Now, the apocalyptic section is the reason that we can date this particular part of the book very precisely. Chapter 11 of the prophecies is a long collection of things which purport to be prophecies, but which are actually a history of struggles between the two Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt to the south, and the Seleucids in Syria, etc., to the north. And poor Judea was squashed between the two. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids often fought. Of course, the Seleucids, the only way you can get to Egypt is through Judea. So poor little Judea for decades had armies marching through intermittently whenever the two Hellenistic kingdoms decided they didn't like each other. Now, an example in chapter 11, a typical passage is, so it's talking about two kingdoms, north and south, and it has 11:36. The king will do as he pleases, and he will speak awful things against the God of gods. He will prosper until wrath is spent, and what has been decreed is accomplished. He will deal with fortified strongholds with the help of an alien god. He will heap honour on those who acknowledge him. At the time of the end, the king of the south will lock horns with him, but the king of the north will attack him. He will invade lands, sweeping through them like a flood. Now, if you look at the many verses in chapter 11, pretty much every part of these verses can be mapped to the history of the struggles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. You could pretty much map it king for king and almost battle for battle. These are cast as prophecies. So we know the book was written sometime during the times of the Hellenistic kingdoms, but we can pin it down even more. Chapter 11 pretty clearly refers to a king called Antiochus IV, whom Daniel refers to as the little horn, because it hates Antiochus IV, really hates him. Antiochus IV, Seleucid king in Syria, and he marches on Egypt, wrests Judea away from Egypt. When Judea was run by the Ptolemies, apparently the Ptolemies ran Judea in a pretty laissez-faire fashion. Are you guys happy in Judea? Yes, Daddy. Okay, just do what you're doing. The Seleucids, particularly under Antiochus IV, had a much heavier hand. Much heavier hand. So heavy, in fact, that under Antiochus IV, Judea broke out into a major rebellion known as the Maccabean Revolt, where a group of priests basically inflamed the land and started this major insurrection, which would eventually lead to Judea becoming independent. Daniel fairly clearly describes Antiochus IV, but it never says that Antiochus IV is defeated. It doesn't know about Antiochus IV's eventual death and defeat. So we can pretty much date Daniel pretty accurately between the start of the Maccabean rebellion, when a Judean would be free to write about how rotten the Seleucids are, but before the death of Antiochus IV in November 164 BC. So this is the most precise dating we can get for any book in the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's really interesting that they do get so specific there.
Chapter 11, which is in effect a coded history of the author's times, has been read as a series of prophecies. As I said before, the kingdom of the north has been interpreted sometimes as Russia and the kingdom of the south as America. I don't know how you work that out. Maybe it was the king of the east and the west. And it's been interpreted as some future conflict to come, whereas scholars are now universally in agreement that this is a coded history, the mid-stage of the Hellenistic kingdoms and the start of the Maccabean Revolt.
Daniel, he really, as one guy who lived, he must have lived, about 300 years at this point?
Well, he's purporting to be writing in Babylonian times, through to early Persian times, but of course he's actually writing 200 years later in Hellenistic times. Because all these prophecies are set during the time of, I think the latest one, he specifically says that he's prophesying in the 3rd year of King Cyrus, but actually you've just raised a good point. He's folktale a bit. In one point he says in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, and the gap between Nebuchadnezzar II and King Cyrus of Persia is 60 or 70 years. Even if he was a real person giving real prophecies, which he wasn't, he would have lived a very long time.
Even the people then, when this was published, must have realized that there was something that was incongruent about how long he lived.
Yeah, well, apparently the book was questioned, and I was surprised to find this. It was questioned as early as the 3rd century AD, or Common Era, depending on how you like to call it, by a guy called Porphyry. And Porphyry said, no, Daniel's a fake. He's not writing in Babylonian or Persian times. He's writing in Hellenistic times. People were seeing through it even as early as that.
In this type of literature, is there any other similar books where the person is purportedly writing at a much earlier time, but was that just an accepted part of the game?
Yeah, it's an accepted part of the game. In fact, it's one of the defining features of the apocalypses. They all purport to be written in the ancient past. One of the famous apocalypses is the apocalypse of Enoch, who lived he was Methuselah's grandfather before the flood. But Enoch, the famous book of First Enoch, that was only written Hellenistic times, maybe, Persian times, maybe. So yeah, they all have a sage of the past purporting to give prophecies, but they're not prophecies. They're more like descriptions of recent events, purporting to have been written hundreds of years before the events actually happened.
Why do they think they did that?
Well, I suppose it's just impressive to give a prophecy, isn't it?
Yeah, it always looks good to give a quick prophecy.
I mean, if I prophesied the First World War, and 600 years from now, after an atomic war or something, no one knew about it, well, I'd be considered, St. Gary, the great prophet.
And you massage the dates a little bit. Gary was actually recording in 1901 when he recorded his podcasts, and he prophesied the World War One, and then, or no, he was recording in 1701. He prophesied the Franco-Prussian War, and then he prophesied World War One and World War Two.
He got some details wrong about the American Revolution, though.
Abraham Lincoln won the American Revolution.
Yeah, against the French.
But that really is, I mean, that's almost about how tight their dating is.
Actually, that's pretty much, that's a pretty good analogy for Daniel. He gets so many, in the folktale bits, he gets so many things utterly wrong. It would be like Abraham Lincoln winning the Revolutionary War against the French.
Yeah, those parts were really strange. In a book that's pretty strange, those ones stuck out as particularly strange. Another part that might not be in your Bible is these additional parts of Daniel that got stapled on, like Bel and the Dragon. What were these other ones that they made it into some canons but not others?
Yeah, they're two little tacked-on bits, chapters 13 and 14. Now, you can find them in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, but they're rejected in the Protestant traditions. And they're in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions because they are in the Septuagint, that thing, which is the Greek translation of the Jewish Old Testament, which was constructed in Egypt during the time of the early Ptolemaic kingdom. Now, this is a Greek translation, and it was used by St. Jerome to construct his Latin translation of the Bible. Now, St. Jerome was quite well aware that these particular chapters 13 and 14, as we would call them, because, of course, Jerome didn't have chapters, he knew that they weren't in the Hebrew texts, but he found them in the Greek texts. Now, Jerome was reluctant to include something he could only find in the Greek, but in the end he just threw his hands up and said, oh, bugger it, okay, I'll put them in anyway. So that's where the Catholics and Orthodox get them. And Martin Luther basically said, no, I'm going to go with St. Jerome's original inclination, and if it's not in the Hebrew, it's not in. Susanna seems to be, it's basically Daniel saves this woman called Susanna from a bunch of lechers. It's not a court story, so it's not Daniel and the king doing something. It's just Daniel saving Susanna. And there's a second one called Bel and the Dragon, and the only notes I have about it is it's two stories about Daniel. I mean, have you read those two in detail, Steve?
No, I was going to read them and then I forgot about it. But it's very bizarre that it almost like Daniel the Superman, like he comes back and in his side time he saves her from a lecher. And then the dragon bit, I did not read the dragon bit. I sadly admit that I did not read that. I thought it was in the version that I was reading, and then I just ran out of time.
If you have a copy of the New American Bible, Revised Edition, which is the officially popally sanctified version for North America, you'll find it in there.
Yeah, or if you have in your grandmother's old stuff, a very old version of the Dewey Reams. And it's just so interesting how that little bit gets tossed in, tossed out. It is included in modern translations, though, or modern versions of the Catholic Bible.
Oh, definitely.
It's interesting, in the Orthodox tradition, they read just about the whole thing of Daniel on the day before Easter, the Saturday before Easter.
Really?
They'll read just about the whole version of it. And I think in the whole Orthodox tradition, at least, that's the only time where they do Old Testament readings.
Oh, that's interesting.
I believe. Yeah, don't send in too nasty emails about that. But that I believe that there's something about that particular service. It's the service before the big Easter one that they read most of the Old Testament. And I believe there's 7 Old Testament readings, and about half of them are from Daniel.
Why is it so popular?
After all of that, I just don't know. It really does. For some reason, I think that those earliest Christians loved Daniel.
Are the Orthodox readings mainly from the folktale bit or the apocalyptic bit, or a mixture of the two?
I want to say the folktale bit, but don't quote me on that. I think that is really interesting. Of all, there's a lot of Old Testament stuff that you could dig through. Daniel gets, in the Jewish tradition, he gets kind of pushed to the side, where the Christians pull him to the fore.
Actually, yeah, that's one thing we should say. In the Jewish tradition, Daniel is included in the third part of the Old Testament Tanakh, in the section called the Ketuvim, which basically means writings, and it's the ragbag collection. It contains Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, all the stuff which is considered pretty much down the list for theology and godly goodness. So that's where Daniel is in the Jewish tradition. But in the Christian tradition, he's one of the 4 major prophets.
In the Jewish tradition, is there any book that was in the Septuagint or was in the old, that was traditional, that just wound up getting on the cutting room floor? Was it a possibility that Daniel could have wound its way in the cutting room floor in the Jewish tradition?
Yes. From what I can gather, Daniel was considered pretty iffy in the Jewish tradition. I mean, the very fact that it's in the writings, for a start, means it's iffy, because as far as we know, the writings was the last section of the Tanakh to be codified and settled on. And in the Jewish tradition, I think it's included mainly because the first part of the book, the folk tales, depict Daniel as a righteous and religious man who triumphs over pagan kings and converts some of these kings to Judaism. And in a way, it's a sort of a mirror of the story of Joseph in Egypt. A pious man is held against his will in a foreign land. He keeps his faith, loves his God, and rises to power. And the early chapters, of course, they would have thought, well, this is reliable history from Babylonian times. And we don't really have much of that history in the old times. So I think it's squeaked in because of that. Maybe another reason it's squeaked in is because at the time that the rabbis were putting together the Ketuvim, which would have been in the 1st, 2nd centuries AD / Common Era, apocalypses were all over the place, and they were very popular. And maybe the rabbis said, okay, right, we should include one, just one, little one, baby one, just to please the people who read this comic book stuff. We're not keen on it. We prefer the serious things, but okay, we'll just let this one sneak through.
There probably really is a kernel of historicity in Daniel. It wouldn't have been shocking to have had a Jew in exile in Babylonia to rise to even to pretty close to the top of the social structure.
Oh yeah, very much so. I think one misconception which people have is that the Jews were basically indentured servants or slave labour in Babylon. But apparently in the last 20, 30 years, we've unearthed Babylonian documents written by Jews, and it indicates they were a quite well-off, commercially successful community.
And if I'm not mistaken, the Babylonian Talmud, wasn't that written in Babylon?
It was.
Fairly close to the end of late antiquity?
It indeed was. There was a huge Jewish community in Babylonia. Some scholars maintain that there were more Jews in Babylonia right through antiquity than there were in the whole of the Roman Empire. I think this is debated, but it is certainly believed that there were millions of Jews in Babylonia, not just like a few thousand or even a few 100,000, but very substantial numbers. And they remained a separate pole from the Judean Jews. And from what we can gather, there was fairly substantial commerce and interaction between them.
I think that's a whole part of history that's been it's not as easily accessible in the West as how much was going on in the Persian Empire during late antiquity and the Middle Ages. It was just as vibrant as what was going on in the Roman Empire. And overall, those people from the Middle East, those empires, they were really good at empires. They knew how to take people that they had conquered, crush them when they needed to crush them, but also bring them in when they were useful.
The Persians seemed to have been the best at it, and the Assyrians were the worst at it.
It's a learning curve.
Yeah, it's a learning curve. I mean, there are several centuries between the two. From what I recall, the Persians were another order of magnitude better at empiring than anyone who'd been before them. I mean, they invented coinage, they had substantial roads, they treated all their subject populations with a great deal of latitude. It seems to have been a fun place to be, pretty much, no matter who you were.
Well, maybe a good place to wrap up today, Gary, is what are you doing new? What are you doing? What are you looking forward to in the history of the Bible?
I am looking forward to getting into the book of Acts and the story of Paul. Now, that's a fascinating story in itself.
Sure is. There's a little bit of everything in Paul.
And how about your shows, Steve?
In the upcoming months, I've decided I'm going to take a little time to look at what was going on in some of the individual parts of the former Roman Empire to see how Christianity was developing locally. There's Spain as one of the places. If I don't stop myself, I'm going to have a whole separate series about just Spain by itself. Who do you think? It's been a little while. Is there somebody offhand from the Bible you think we should put on trial? I don't think we can put Daniel on trial.
No, he hasn't done anything really, has he?
He's a good guy.
Yeah, he seems a nice guy. Maybe too much into the magic mushies in the second part of the book, but hey. Oh, who could we put on trial?
Jonah's slightly jerky.
Oh, Jonah, the funniest book in the Bible, and probably the only funny book in the Bible.
The whale is almost a side thing of how crazy Jonah is.
Oh, yeah, it's a virtual footnote, isn't it? But it's the only thing people remember. But the book is an actual hoot. I mean, it starts off with God saying to Jonah, right, I got a mission for you. And he goes, yeah, God? I want you to go to the capital of Assyria and convert them.
And I'm going to go in the exact opposite direction.
Because that's the dumbest thing he's ever heard.
Yeah, he's a good one. So many good ones to put on trial. I think that's something we need to fire up again.
I think that's a good idea, yeah.
Maybe that's something we put out to the audience. If there's somebody who you'd love to see put on trial, we'd love to put, Gary always loves to put his Satan
Oh, yeah.
robes on.
Oh, yeah. I like to put the horns on.
Well, I think I've learned a ton about Daniel in doing this research. I hope everyone has, and definitely look forward to more of these collaborations. There's the Bible is just an endless font of collaborations for Gary and Steve.
Oh, that's right. And there's so much of the Bible. So much.
We will see you next time. We hope you enjoy.
Bye-bye, guys.